Generally, we think of the most commonly used Pokemon as the good ones, and the ones that are used less, well, there's a reason for that. This does give a general picture of a metagame fairly well, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story, and there are some Pokemon that are quite good, yet in spite of this are weirdly rare. Maybe they're hard to fit, maybe they're underrated by the player base of a certain time, maybe both. Whatever the case, we've assembled several such Pokemon, and we'll be exploring why, for all their talents, their usage seems strangely lower than it should be. Starting right off with Nidoking. Nidoking was a metagame-defining threat in Gen 2's heyday, but fell off after with the Gen 2 event move, the sleep-inducing Lovely Kiss, being removed from its move pool in Gen 3 and onward. And since the majority of its power came from the threat of sleep, the rest of its toolkit was unable to compensate, as its attacking stats and coverage were good, but the stats weren't good enough to make the coverage work, and since ground-type competition was as stringent as it was, you were likelier to use Nidoqueen for its greater defense. That is until Gen 6, where Nidoking received the Sheer Force ability in a world of fairy types, and suddenly with its poison stab becoming incredibly valuable for instantly deleting Pokemon famously difficult to break with repeated attacks, it now had real dual stab combination, becoming an offensive poison type as much as a ground type, as well as packing the power needed to transcend its stats and become one of the hardest hitters around. Suddenly that amazing special coverage was put to use, both in terms of strength and how well it complemented its newly excellent pair of stabs. What made Nidoking so scary though wasn't just that it hit so many things so hard. Yes, the way it threatened one-hit KOs left and right against metagames' defensive staples and perfect health was already incredibly rare and valuable, but the reason it unleashed this threat so effortlessly was how uniquely blessed it also was in terms of longevity. It was resistant to Stealth Rock and immune to Toxic, Thunder Wave, Sandstorm, and thanks to Sheer Force, even the recoil of its own life orb. It actually pushed its toxic immunity one step further. It was a grounded poison type, so it provided its team support in absorbing opposing toxic spikes on entry. In addition to not getting worn down, Nidoking also had a perfectly functional speed stat of base 85, being faster than other staples and wall breakers like Heatran, Dragonite, Mamoswine, and Hoopa Unbound, which meant it was hardly too slow for the job. It had no problem getting to jump on a ton of the metagame's most key targets. Even Nidoking's most obvious weakness, its frailty, wasn't as bad as it seemed, considering its fairy resist, in addition to its aforementioned resilience, and it was an excellent switch into none other than Clefable. And besides Clefable, the plethora of switch moves in the metagame made it easy for Nidoking to safely hit the field against a Heatran or a Ferrothorn, which Nidoking could also enter against on well-timed predictions against entry hazards, Toxic, or Protect, while being able to take a hit in a pinch. It was hardly a Deoxys attack level of frailty. In Gen 7 and 8, its wall breaking and Toxic Spikes absorption just got more valuable, so therein lies the mystery. Why was Nidoking an adroit all-around balance crusher in metagames that were so focused on and defined by balance so rare relative to its potential? This is not to say it's an obscure pick. It is definitely recognized as viable in all three generations it has Sheer Force before Gen 9's power creep took over. But of course, its frailty alongside a speed stat that is functional yet a far cry from great means it struggles greatly against more offensively minded teams. Despite the prevalence of balanced squads, generally players prefer methods that don't fall so flat in faster paced games. Even something as slow and frail as Crawdon, another similarly unwallable defense destroyer, packs the useful utility of its powerful priority Aqua Jet. None of the terror Nidoking packs against balance is present against offense whatsoever. Additionally, hard stall teams packing Chansey or Blissey have no trouble walling it at all. Most preferred balance destroyers whose anti-defensive utility extended to stall as well. Make no mistake, Nidoking's brand of special attacking destruction was incredibly unique and powerful, but its limits were there, and yet it was so good at what it did, in fact nearly peerless at so unstoppably demolishing such a dominant playstyle, that it does feel weird to not see it used more. Now we move on to a Pokemon Nidoking often faced off against in Gen 2 with Raikou. But before we talk about the next mon, here are some earbuds you should definitely use with our sponsor Raycon. It's the new year, and I'm sure you have a lot of New Year's resolutions you want to focus on. Enhance that focus with Raycon's open earbuds. Honestly, I don't know how I'd get through the day without my Raycons. In fact, I use my Raycons literally every day because I literally can't do chores without listening to something, be it music, a podcast, or an audiobook. These essential open earbuds are feather light, as you don't even feel that they're there. Seriously, I can leave them on for hours and I forget they're even on. And they also have a great balance of audio since they are better at letting in your surroundings. For example, you can go for a walk and listen to your favorite podcast, but still be aware of traffic, which is something I often do. They also hold an insane amount of battery with a 36-hour battery time. I don't have to charge these often. How convenient. I really don't know how I'd get through the day without the Raycon Essential Open Earbuds. The Essential Open Earbuds are here for the New Year's sale and they're selling fast. So just click the link in the description below or go to buyraycon.com/FSGOpen for 20% off site-wide during their New Year's sale. Raikou also struggled after its Gen 2 heyday, where it was both a potent attacker and a premier wall, because the walling ability was no more, and it didn't get the same kind of explosive power boost that Nidoking got, which isn't to say it didn't get anything or it didn't have a lot to like, because it did. It just fell into more of a hit or miss situation. Calm Mind sets were a major threat in advance, then completely fell off the map for what felt like forever due to newly perceived inconsistency, then came roaring back once players realized just how incredible the tools Raikou was working with were. Having such a potent boosting move and stab alongside a Pokemon of its speed, which got the jump on even the fast guns, meant it could either be seriously lights out late game or it could wreak havoc early game when it didn't have to be so cautious with its health. Both strategies though demanded much accommodation of its primary weakness. While it did threaten many Pokemon with instant KOs, in the event it didn't do so, it was probably looking at getting KO'd back, and if it didn't, it was probably because it was getting walled. In Gen 4 it had a similar trajectory to Gen 3, minus the eventual comeback, which was especially strange considering its destructive potential was greater than ever, with its gaining of the event move Aura Sphere, which allowed it to blast through several of the metagame's most key targets in Tyranitar, Heatran, and Clefable. It was still a specific overall Pokemon, yes, but even with such specificity, it went largely overlooked for how effectively it dismantled many metagame standards like Zapdos. However, in Gen 5 it just weirdly didn't fit, considering it was such an apt overall Pokemon. Very fast, quite strong, good natural special bulk, stab Thunderbolt, and an efficiently complementary move pool. Even though it wasn't the only Pokemon with these talents, it tended to actually beat most of its competitors head on, yet this wasn't enough. In Gen 6, its Assault Vest set returned to standard play as a general offensive-defensive check to sprawling early metagame chaos, but that too fell off after the early tumultuous period of the meta where players were still trying to figure stuff out. Eventually, the time had passed on the AB checks every special attacker era, where it was tasked with handling everything from Greninja Hydro Pumps to Thundurus' Focus Blast, since there was now a more defined metagame, and that meta thus shifted more towards bulk, making it simple to see how hard and flat that Raikou could fall, even once it abandoned Assault Vest in favor of the threat of Calm Mind. It's strange because realistically, how much more can you give a mono electric type? It's got the move pool, the stats, and yet it's consistently not enough, even though it seems like it could be, especially as its move pool expands over the generations. The same generation it lost Hidden Power, it also gained the incredible Scald as its new anti-ground move, and could additionally use Aura Sphere from a timid nature, at long last, as opposed to the rash one that the move had previously been required to have from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. And speaking of rash, it'd be rash to say this next mon was rarely seen with Metagross. Now, this is not referring to Mega Metagross. That is one of the most perfect destructive machines Game Freak has ever concocted. However, that doesn't mean base Metagross was any sort of slouch itself. Even after Gen 5's nerf to the explosion that it previously used to shred even Skarmory, Metagross should have a lot to like. Maybe it wouldn't live up to the excellence of its first two gens, but its fall and subsequent rarity still seems strange. A tad excessive even, considering how much its typing still offered. After all, the same type Jirachi kept going gen after gen, even after picking up Dark and Ghost weaknesses in Gen 6, because that's where it also picked up an excellent Fairy Resist, and just as in the 3rd and 4th gens, the two dominated together. Metagross still has several outstanding qualities that shouldn't make it so easily replaceable. The most notable is its much more powerful stab. Despite the Gen 6 power nerf, Metagross's Meteor Mash still makes Jirachi's Iron Head, for all its flinch terror antics, look like it gets outdamaged by the Rocky Helmet users it often thuds into. Said Mash, thanks to its clear body ability, can't be intimidated. In a world of Landier Styrian, isn't that beautiful? Metagross also could leverage that excellent typing and sturdy bulk to more concrete ends than just generalized power. It could pursuit trap important Pokemon like Latios, it could set up with agility for a late game sweep, and its agility sets often went without explosion for the better coverage anyway, so that was hardly a loss. It could trick an Iron Ball to ruin something like Rotom Wasp just as well as before. And so, yes, it did have some niches. Occasional Choice Band and agility sets could be seen in Gen 5, while sets had some merit in Gen 6, but these were incredibly rare, and when they did see use, even if they did have some value to them, they overall served more to illustrate the limits that kept Metagross from being used most of the time. What made its rarity strange, though, were that these limits were not quite its own, as you could level near identical charges at the Pokemon it was competing with, if not Jirachi, then Scizor, the latter of which was generally even more exploitable in its weak points. However, through their other forms of utility, for one, both Pokemon made copious use of U-Turn, they managed to impact the game more. A lot of it had to do with recovery in one form or another. Jirachi would either Wish or Healing Wish, while Scizor had Roost. Metagross got more worn down and wasn't enough of a wall breaker to compensate, nor was its late game agility threat as lights out as Scizor's Swords Dance Bullet Punch. The gulf between Metagross and its competitors wasn't enormous, but it was clear and not easily bridged. And so even though Metagross was far from actually being bad, it functionally became bad because you would so rarely want to use it over them, hence the low usage, even though there's so much to like with how it seems to match up well into so many Pokemon. In a similar vein, we move on to Togekiss. Once you get past the Jirachi-esque flinch happy evil of Serene Grace Air Slash, you realize that Togekiss is also similar to Rachi in that it is utterly overloaded with excellent options. It can also add paralysis to the flinching madness with Thunder Wave, except since it's a flying type, ground types are hardly going to be fixing to take it on too enthusiastically, especially since Togekiss can also force its way through them with air slashes that don't need to flinch nearly as much as Iron Head when they are boosted by its nasty plot. Oh, you can't stave it off with status either, not if it's running Heal Bell, which also happens to support its whole team, nor can you take advantage of it with Flying Resist when it dips into its excellent coverage repertoire of Aura Sphere and Flamethrower or Fire Blast. Okay, normal flying typing is lame, but then in Gen 6, it sheds even that in favor of the incredibly gifted Fairy Flying, gaining not just a Dragon immunity and Dark resistance, but trading its fighting neutrality for a Quad resist while gaining secondary stab if it desires. In the same generation, the Sandstorm that previously hindered its longevity is no longer permanent, which is a similarly big buff as the Fogs, which now makes it easier to deal with that other problem, Stealth Rock. Plus, it's just so bulky, so it should be able to make work just as Zapdos does, especially now that it's so loaded with incredible resists and immunities. None of this is really wrong, nor is it undercut by some major flaw. Yeah, its speed isn't that impressive, but it's got Thunder Wave. The fact that electric types can no longer be paralyzed starting in Gen 6 definitely doesn't help, but with Nasty Plot, Roost, and enormous special defense, alongside the fact that Zapdos and Rotowash's primary electric move often tends to be Volt Switch, Togekiss can potentially deal with them just fine. Whatever criticism you can leverage at Togekiss regarding how it can be stopped, however fairly, it can also generally find a way to deal with it. Generally. Okay, it can't fit every move at once, which is true, but this also applies to plenty of successful Pokemon, and it doesn't hold them back from being great. So what is holding Togekiss back and keeping its usage so low? Knowing how utterly unstoppable it can be when that bulk combines with Nasty Plot and a propensity to flinch through your answer, whether it resists flying or not, it seems to be both a case of it being underrated, which it always was even when it was at its best, and a case of how it demands quite a bit of support while taking a while to get going. It asks for a lot while not always delivering as much as you'd want it to. Though again, its upside was so ridiculously high as to have merited more usage than it got. In a similar vein, next up we've got Conkeldurr, the second coming of Machamp, which perhaps fittingly also includes Conkeldurr's perception as either an unstoppable menace or totally useless. A classic case of massive power undermined by low speed. But how much of this can be attributed to Conk's own flaws, and how much can be attributed to the general inflation of those flaws, which, while hardly insignificant, were also hardly anything that couldn't be worked around, especially since, given the plethora of possibility around its many immense talents to be figured out, efforts to do so often reap enormous benefits. In other words, yes, Conk is slow and has bad special defense, but it's also ridiculously dangerous with a number of sets, which makes it both relatively specialized and underrated simultaneously. Among what it can do is pump its special defense investment on a bulk up set, which, thanks to its gargantuan HP, makes it deceptively difficult to take out on the special side, and can result in quite a snowball of a sweep when it's recovering off damage taken with boosted drain punches. Assault Vest is also a fine option come Gen 6, though it generally leans into it more actively, pushing its already huge power further, as it does with its 3 incredible abilities. Guts makes it a physical attacker that relishes taking burn, especially once burn damage was nerfed in Gen 7, which it sometimes leans into with Flame Orb sets, easily healing the chip off with a strengthened Drain Punch, while also gaining an incredibly powerful facade to demolish the fairy types that came around in Gen 6 to thwart its usual array of attacks, as well as its boosted knockoff. Apart from Guts, Iron Fist is tremendous alongside its many punching attacks, Drain, Mach, Thunder, Ice, and sometimes even Focus, which warrants its higher risk with trades so ridiculous as to one-hit KO many variants of Skarmory. It can also get stronger and rid itself of Life Orb recoil on Thunder and Ice Punch with sheer force. Now, the speed is paltry, and there's only so much to be done about the vulnerability to special attacks, but these are simply the cost of doing business for such a powerful Pokemon, and not unreasonable ones either. When you consider how brutally difficult it is to wall, as well as the fact that its powerful Mach Punch is an ever-useful revenge-killing tool for a myriad of speedy threats, dating back to when it picked off Sandrush Estradrill under Eternal Sandstorm in Gen 5, while it also doesn't exactly have the most difficult time switching in against physical attacks, hardly necessitating a team of switch move users just like Nidoking or Crawdon, though it wouldn't say no, of course. Sometimes Conkeldurr will show up to extremely dominant effect, gaining an especially notable resurgence in Gen 5, but on the whole, while it isn't really supposed to be a high-usage Pokemon, something with such dangerous all-around power, versatility, and ease of use definitely feels a little weird to see it not used as much as it should. Now we're taking that concept almost as far as it goes with one of the biggest hitters of all, one mentioned earlier in this video with Hoopa Unbound. Hoopa Unbound, or Hoopa U, was a decidedly strange case. It was banned in Gen 6, as one might expect from a Pokemon bearing Slaking's attack, Cure White special attack, and no absurdly hindering qualities like, say, Truant or non-existent bulk and speed. Hoopa U's base 80 speed was just right for the job, and at 80 base HP alongside 130 base special defense, it was actually incredibly specially tanky for such an absurd powerhouse. It would never be one-hit KO'd by a Specs Latios Draco Meteor, for instance. On the other hand, many reputable players thought its ban was unwarranted, and that though it was incredibly powerful and had an immensely spammable Dark Stab, its many flaws meant you didn't have to go out of your way to handle it. You take it on as you would any other wall breaker. For instance, it was so physically frail that despite not being weak to dark itself, it was easily removed by the incredibly common pursuit, especially with how both its stabs invited Tyranitar in, and how incredibly vulnerable it was to all forms of passive damage. Its low speed and physical frailty also meant offensive teams had no trouble running over. Being quadruple weak to U-turn sure didn't help. At most, it would get 1 KO in such a matchup, and usually would be relegated to mere death fodder, which made it no different from Kyurem Black in this regard. Almost as if to prove this point, in the following generation, Hoopa U was used so little, despite becoming much more threatening on paper. Psychic Terrain and Z-moves to give it even more weight of instant KOs, gaining knockoff as a new stab, a brand new target to destroy in Toxapex. It was also used much less, so much so that far from going back to Uber, it didn't even stay in OU. It actually fell into UU, however brief that was. It had an acknowledged OU niche for sure, but you would expect this smashing machine of the highest order to have more of a place, especially since it's uncommonly bulky on the special side. This is a fairly weak wall breaker that requires no bulk investment to survive a Tapu Lele Moonblast. It feels strange for Hoopa U to exist in these seemingly contradictory spaces. It was banned, but shouldn't have been, because it was overrated. However, then it wasn't banned, and it wasn't used enough. Were the two metagames so vastly different? It seems more that the ban was a knee-jerk reaction to a new Pokemon of staggering strength, and a game constantly seeming to one-up itself in this regard, with this premature ban not giving the player base time to adapt to the choice spec set that had been deemed the overwhelming factor. And then, once time had passed, and the player base knew Hoopa U's deal in Gen 7, it somehow looped around to not getting used enough, even though it's unwallable on a level that makes most other dangerous wall breakers look like Clefable food by comparison. Further supporting this idea is the fact that Hoopa U actually does quite well in Gen 9, despite the power creep leaving 7's weight in the dust. Now, having looked at several wall destroyers of strangely sparse uses, we're going to finish things off by going in a different direction with an unbreakable, immovable wall Celesteela. When Celesteela came out, it was Skarmory for the age of Tapus, and with all the tools for every department one would need to keep up in such high-octane times. It was incredibly bulky both physically and specially, letting it leverage that famous typing into switching into threats as dangerous and assorted as Kartana and Tapu Lele. It didn't have the reliable recovery of Roost, but instead took a more active, threatening approach with Leech Seed, one of the best moves in the game. It was Ferrothorn-esque in how Leech Seed and Protect genuinely threatened to make it unbreakable for many teams whose only Pokemon capable of hurting it would get worn down ridiculously quickly. Celesteela also assisted in speeding up this wearing down because, unlike Skarm, it actually hit genuinely hard, with a powerful stab Heavy Slam and even the coverage of Flamethrower, which not only let it immediately threaten the Pokemon it was responding to, but also ensured Leech Seed immunities would not be able to switch in and blank its most dangerous move. In fact, it would be switching into these grass types and Magikarp for Fable. There was a time where Celesteela commonly paired with Toxapex for one of the most ridiculously unshakable two Pokemon defensive cores to ever be seen in standard play. Even their shared electric weakness in the land of Tapu Koko didn't faze them one bit, especially as Tapu Koko did not switch into Seela freely at all. Over time though, this new paragon of OU defense, while it wouldn't disappear, certainly stopped seeing the usage it once enjoyed, seeing as its all-purpose tanking was all too appreciated in a metagame full of Greninja and Magearna and their many movesets. It seems strange, especially as its Leech Seed strategy was as devastating to offense as ever. Additionally, Leech Seed as its primary method of making progress, while certainly effective, did make it easier to outlast in longer games against bulkier teams with more focus on longevity. But when Celesteela walled a team, there was nothing like it. It had so many matchups against otherwise solid offense teams where it auto-beat just about everything. It couldn't even be trapped by Magnezone nearly as reliably as Skarmory, thanks to its amazing special defense alongside Leech Seed, Protect, and Flamethrower. It gained new peaks alongside a grass type, either Ferrothorn or especially Mega Venusaur, so as to Leech Seed seemingly everything in sight. There's walling, and then there's using your walling as a method of attack, quickly closing the already limited window your opponent has to break through you. The latter is far more threatening, and Celesteela was exemplary for how dangerous it could be. It well and truly wound up weirdly rare for how uniquely talented it was. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardeen, Zathor for their major support of our videos.